Hi, this is Sierra, Xixi, Natalie, and Sarah's group, and we're going to talk about cacti distribution on north and south facing slope in the Sunderland Park.
To start out, we wanted to talk about connections that we were making to class as we were collecting data. And one of the connections that we made was shade tolerance versus drought tolerance and how there's a trade-off between plants. So we know that cacti are drought tolerant, but they are not shade tolerant. But they were also growing amongst different grass species and different plant species that were not drought tolerant, but they were also competing with cacti for resources and more specifically light is what we're kind of looking at. Um, Another thing to note is that cacti are cam plants, so their photosynthesis is a bit less efficient, and they also split up their photosynthesis by through night and day.
Another connection to class that we thought about was sunlight intensity, specifically because we know that cacti are not shade tolerant. So that's something we decided to focus on in our data collection. We decided to compare the average amount of cacti growing on the north and south facing slopes because the different slopes get different amounts of sunlight throughout the day. We also decided to take data from the top of the hill because that gets the most sunlight throughout the day. And then a general thing to note is that the south slope does get more sunlight throughout the day than the north facing slope.
And another thing that we thought was a cool connection was basically R-star and species competition overall. And R-star is, the minimum resources required for a population to establish. And the cacti has like a lower R-star in terms of like water necessity and a higher R-star than other vegetation for light. And something that we thought was interesting too was basically like when the canopies are closed, light is like the main source of competition. However, when the canopies are open, other resources such as like water and nutrients are also like being competed for. And there is some notable competition after disturbances, which will be discussed a little bit later on in the presentation.
So our main research question was, how does cacti distribution vary in relation to differing levels of elevation and north versus south slopes on a hill?
This is just a visual of our study site. So off to the right of the photo, that's kind of where the entrance of Sonderman Park is and where we all usually walk into the park. But then we decided to collect data on that hill that is right in like front of us once you enter the park. And you can kind of see the little yellow pinpoints is on the top right. Pinpoint is the north slope that we collected data on. You can't really tell, but the slope kind of starts where that little pinpoint is, and then the top of the hill is super flat, which is the middle of the photo, and then towards the bottom left, that's the south slope. And that's the other place that we collected data, and you kind of like just see the visual. And then the north slope that we collected data on was 28 meters approximately. The south slope was approximately 20 meters. And then on the hill itself, we found prickly pear and neon hedgehog cacti, which are kind of like the barrel cacti on the hill. We also found shrubs and grasses that were growing amongst the cacti. And there were small amounts of disturbances that Sierra mentioned, and we also will be talking about those disturbances and their impact on our data later on in the presentation.
So the way that we went about this to actually collect all the data is we basically split into two different groups to go measure like the north versus the south side of the hill. And we got like a little tape measure and we started at the top all the way to the bottom, and we split like the hill into three different sections: top, middle, bottom. And then we used the little like quadrant, which is what's in the picture right there, and we threw it across the line, three different tabs for each section. And we repeated this all the way till we got to the bottom, and then we did two more of those lines, I guess, just so we could have a reasonable amount of like data points and like hopefully a little bit more accurate stuff. And then we also did 9 throws at the top of the hill, just so we could have like kind of a comparison of, a little bit of a different location.
So here's how we went and analyzed the data we collected from the experiment. First, we kind of look at the north and south slope data individually, then we're going to compare them with each other on like cacti distribution throughout the slope. We're also looking at the spine length and density of the cacti versus like the section of the hill. We'll also look at if bare ground has an effect on the density of the clumps of the cacti, or if other vegetation has an effect. And at last, we're going to talk about some notable observation and how it connects to the class content and our experiment. So in the north slope data, as you can see, this is a graph of the number of cacti and on the north facing slope as the slope goes. On the x-axis, you can see it's divided into the top section, the middle section, and the bottom section. And on the y-axis, you have the number of cacti. You can kind of see a line of correlation in this graph. That is, as the slope decreases, like the number of cacti decrease. And you can also see there is more points on the top section of the data than the bottom section of the data. This means we have a more regular, like a more consistent encounterment with cacti on the top section of the slope, rather than comparing with the bottom section of the slope, which has a lower encounter rate. This means like when we randomly throw up the quadrant and it just randomly lands somewhere, on the top section, it usually lands on the cactus, and on the bottom section, sometimes we have no cactus appear in the quadrant.
So on the south slope, it was pretty full sun. We saw lots of cacti growing in large clumps, especially beneath bushes. There was also a hiking trail that went through the middle section of the hill. That and maybe some erosion was causing some disturbance, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But as for the actual data points from the cacti distribution on the south slope, as you can see in the top, the data points from the top section of the hill are pretty varied. There were either a lot of cacti or not very many at all. And then in the middle section, there are pretty steadily high to medium numbers of cacti. Again, this is because, or we think this is because of the disturbance that was occurring in that area. And then towards the bottom of the hill, typically there were no cacti at all. We did have a couple anomalies where cacti were growing in the shade, but we'll also talk about that a little bit later. And then to compare the north and south slopes, overall, the yellow line on this graph is when we did the 9 throws on the very top of the hill, just to find the average cacti distribution on the very top. And that was about 11 cacti in each quadrat that we threw. So that's kind of just a threshold line. And then to compare the north and south facing slope lines, the blue one is the south slope. And overall, there are more cacti on the south slope than on the north slope, which is the black line. And this is just due to the fact that there's a lot more sun on the south slope more consistently throughout the day. So the cacti are able to grow a little bit better. As for the south slope line specifically, it starts out pretty high and then gets even higher towards the middle, again, due to the cacti being able to grow even better in the disturbed areas. And then it tapers off, or it drops off a little bit more drastically once you move towards the bottom of the hill. And that's similar for the north slope line as well. It starts off pretty high throughout the top and middle sections of the hill, and then drops off towards the bottom of the hill as we start losing sunlight intensity.
Along with looking at the distribution of cacti in relation to the top sections, middle sections, and bottom sections of each slope on the different sides of the hill, we also kind of wanted to look at the cacti spine density and the cacti length of the different like cacti and how they might vary in relation to like the cacti at the top of the hill versus the middle and then the bottom of the hill. We kind of thought that the cacti at the top of the hill would have much longer and more dense spine distribution, just because they like have more sunlight and they have more energy to really exert, and they have more energy to spend on making like longer and making more protective spines. And then as you go down the hill, they wouldn't have as much energy, just due to more shade and more competition. But something that we found that that was true for the south-facing slope. There was a stronger correlation, R-square value of 0.3. And as we went down the hill, you can see that it went from like top to bottom, and then the spine density kind of went from like the more dense spines to the not as dense spines. That's also because as we went down the hill, we just our encounter rate of cacti just decreased basically to 0 for some of our throws. But then in comparison, the north slope didn't really have as strong of a trend line. The R-square value was only 0.076. And that was mainly because a lot of the cacti, even found towards the middle and the bottom of the hill, had pretty like medium density spines. So they had, and we are thinking that that might be because there were a lot more spots that lacked other vegetation besides cacti. So that might have possibly decreased the cacti competition, which allows the cacti to kind of exert more energy on growing their spines, be more dense, and be longer for protection, and for synthetic help, as opposed to the plants on the south slope that kind of had an increase in competition as they went down the hill towards the bottom. And this trend, and this trend was pretty similar with the cacti spine length. There wasn't that strong of a correlation with the north or south slope, but we are thinking that the reasons for this lack of correlation is also the same reasons as the lack of correlation with the spine density. There was somewhat of a correlation with the south slope. As you go down the hill, there the spine length decreases, but the correlation was not as strong as the density.
When we look at the bare ground versus clumps data on the north and south slope, we can see on both slopes it is not that significant. However, it is more significant on the south slope than the north slope. As you can see on the south slope, as the number of clumps goes up, there is more intersection with the bare ground, and whereas at the north slope there is pretty not really a relationship. It's pretty constant, and we suspect this is because in the south slope there is no light limitation because it is constantly lit by the sun. There is more competition for other resources, and thus there is a more significant correlation on the south side of the slope.
Sweet. So along the way, there's also a lot of really interesting different types of like plant species along the north and south slopes, such as like sage, oats, and different types of grass, which ultimately had a relationship with the number of cacti clumps throughout the hill. So the graph on the left is showing the number of cacti clumps versus graph on the right, number of cacti clumps versus other vegetation. And basically as the number of other like vegetation increased, the cacti clump remained consistently low and like steadily decrease. And this could be because of more species to compete with like light, water, and nutrients within the area. And obviously we have like this one outlier, which could have been like a disturbance or something else. But the graph on the left is showing like the number of cacti clumps specifically against the grama grass. And what we found was that, the two didn't really have an effect on one another, and they can almost coexist together. And that's probably just because of the type of grass that it is. And it's not until, other specific vegetation comes into play where there's a notable effect on cacti clumps. And from our data, we found that, vegetation that had a large effect on cacti was the different types of grass along the slope, which will be discussed next.
So on this graph, you can see that we have the grama grass in blue, which is a bunch grass, which means that it typically allows cacti to grow a little bit more easily. And then we have the approximate number of cacti clumps in black, and the thicker turf grass, which has more ground coverage in the yellow. So as you can see with the trend lines, the trend line for the grama grass decreases pretty much at the same rate as the cacti clumps. So they're both decreasing pretty steadily from the top to the bottom of the hill. And then the thicker turf grass steadily increases, and there is a point at which the thicker turf grass outcompetes the grama grass and the cacti clumps. So that's why at the bottom of the hill, you won't find any cacti or any grama grass, but it'll be primarily the thicker turf grass. And then for some notable observations, we've been talking a lot about disturbance, specifically where the hiking trail was, or maybe where some erosion occurred. And as you can see in the photo we have on this slide, this is one of the bunches of prickly pear that we saw growing in the disturbed area. It was very large clumps growing in these disturbed areas, especially the prickly pear. And we decided that there are two main reasons this happens. One main reason is that the disturbance itself, it kind of eliminates competition for the cacti because all the other species in the area will be wiped out. So then the cacti have an easier time establishing and repopulating that area. And then the second reason is because of the way prickly pear reproduce with flowers and seeds, their little pads or cladodes break off, and then roots can grow out of those cladodes and form new prickly pear. So when the disturbance happened, what likely happened was the prickly pear plants were broken up, and then each cladode was able to form its own new plant. So that's why there are such large clumps of prickly pear in the disturbed areas and why they're so dense.
Another observation we made is that cacti, we found like usually a big clumps of cacti under a pretty big bush. And we suspect that this is because the bushes take off is a main competitor for water, and it outcompetes all the grass species. But since cacti is the most drought tolerant out of all the species, it's able to survive under the bushes, even though the bushes might shade it a little bit and give it less sunlight. So yeah, like the competitiveness for water has allowed cacti to establish under bushes and outcompete all the other species, and therefore we can see a more significant clumps under the bushes.
Another notable observation was that we found that cacti were growing in shade. Some of the cacti on the south slopes were able to grow in the slightly taller grasses and also in moderate amounts of shade. And we were thinking that maybe it might just be because of the position of the sun throughout the day and how it changes position. So maybe during like some times of the day, the cacti are able to get just enough light to properly photosynthesize. Sunflecks also allow cacti to get just enough sunlight to properly survive, and sunflecks are just kind of when there's like little flecks of light through the canopy. In this case, the canopy would be like grass and like the shrubs, but those little flecks of light allow the cacti to get enough sun. So that's kind of why we found that some cacti might have been growing in shade.
And the last notable observation was basically the transition from like bunch grass to turf grass. So, you know, as grama grass like decreased going down like the northern slope, near the bottom, like the turf grass basically increased, and like cacti clump numbers also decreased. And this is because like, you know, grass is either like a type of bunch grass where it allows for like these little like open spaces for other vegetation to basically grow, or it's like a turf grass, which kind of just takes over the entire area. And so basically, like, since the bottom of the hill was turf grass, it really didn't like have a space for like cacti to flourish and grow. And so it was kind of like an interesting point that explained like another reason like why cacti numbers were just decreasing as we got closer to the bottom of the hill. Sweet. And we just want to thank you so much for listening to our presentation about cacti clumps at Soderman Park.